In the heavy, humid summer of 1847, an insurance investigator named Samuel Hartwell stumbled upon a pattern that would haunt him until the end of his life. Along the Charleston-Columbia Road, 17 life insurance claims had been filed in just 8 months. All of them involved healthy men aged between 25 and 50. All of them had died suddenly, their deaths attributed to heart failure while staying at quiet roadside inns. What chilled Hartwell was not merely the number of deaths, it was the uncanny similarities between them. Each body had been discovered with the same strange detail, a faintly sweet smell lingering on the victim's breath, and delicate oleander petals scattered across the room, as if arranged with intention. Local officials dismissed the deaths as natural misfortunes. After all, travel through the low country during the suffocating summer months was infamous for fevers, exhaustion, and sudden illness. But as Hartwell pressed deeper, he uncovered a design too precise to be coincidence, a calculated web of murder, so methodical and so cold that it exposed a predator hidden in plain sight. The victims were not vagrants or unknown drifters. They were prosperous men, merchants, planters, brokers who had stopped to rest after long journeys. They would arrive at country inns weary, but alive except a cordial drink or a special tonic from the charming hostesses, and within hours succumb to a mysterious collapse. Their insurance policies, signed not long before their deaths, were paid out without question. In total, the payouts amounted to over $85,000, a staggering fortune at the time, quietly funneled into the hands of someone who had mastered the art of appearing benevolent while orchestrating tragedy. Before we continue with the tale of the infamous 6-mile Wayfarer house and the woman who turned Southern hospitality into something far deadlier, we'd like to pause for a moment. If you enjoy these forgotten chapters of America's darker past, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. We love hearing from our community of mystery enthusiasts scattered across the world. The truth about Lavinia Fisher, as Hartwell would discover, was far darker than polite Charleston society could have ever imagined. His investigation would reveal that the deadliest predator on South Carolina's roads did not wear the face of a highway bandit, but the smile of a lady in silk. She quoted scripture at church, socials, moved gracefully through drawing rooms, and served tea laced with poison, her charm disarming the very men who thought themselves safe in her care. Charleston in 1847 was a city of contradictions. It was among the South's most prosperous ports. Its cobblestone streets, lined with proud Georgian and federal homes, its spires and columns rivaling those of London or Paris. The Ashley and Cooper rivers curved around the peninsula like protective arms, their mirrored waters reflecting the grandeur of St. Michael's steeple. Spanish moss swayed from ancient oaks, creating a dreamlike beauty that softened the city's harshest truths. The brutal economy of slavery, the ruthless rivalries among merchants, and the constant pressure of maintaining appearances in a society obsessed with hierarchy. Here, birthright meant as much as wealth. The elite secured their place through arranged marriages, strategic alliances, and the unspoken code that demanded women remain ornamental, genteel, and submissive. A lady's world was expected to revolve around watercolor sketches, French conversation, and the delicate art of supervising household slaves. any woman who dared step beyond those boundaries risked her reputation and, by extension, the ruin of her entire family. Beyond the city walls, the Charleston-Columbia Road pulsed with commerce. Planters, cotton brokers, and land speculators traveled its length, carrying not just ledgers and contracts, but whispers of opportunity and fortunes in hard currency. They were men of means, prime targets for someone who knew how to lull them into complacency. And soon, Samuel Hartwell would discover that on this road of prosperity, death was waiting behind the very doors where weary travelers sought safety. The Charleston-Columbia Road was infamous for its solitude, twisting through endless corridors of pine where highwaymen sometimes lay in wait. It crossed swampy lowlands where Spanish moss hung like mourning veils, and where the black water concealed both alligators and secrets that could rest undisturbed for decades. To travel this road was to accept a gamble. The accommodations scattered along the route reflected this same uncertainty. Some inns patronized by wealthy planters offered genuine comfort, silver service, well-furnished rooms, and meals fit for gentlemen's table. Others promised little more than shelter from the weather and food of questionable origin. Experienced travelers took nothing for granted. They relied on personal recommendations, avoiding inns that could not produce a letter of reference from a respected Charleston family. Into this landscape stepped Samuel Hartwell, 34 years old, representing the Mutual Assurance Company of Virginia. Hartwell had already earned a reputation for solving cases that seemed impossible. His Harvard education, meticulous habits, and unusual willingness to chase down the smallest detail set him apart from the more casual investigators favored in the South. Where others looked for simple answers, Hartwell pursued hidden patterns, and in 12 years of work, once he committed to a case, he had never failed to resolve it. At first, the string of life insurance claims raised little alarm at Mutual Assurance's Charleston office. Middle-aged businessmen dropping suddenly dead was hardly rare in the Low Country, where yellow fever, malaria, and cholera struck with merciless regularity. The climate itself was punishing, and men accustomed to pushing themselves often collapsed under the combined strain of heat exhaustion and ambition. But Hartwell's trained eye noticed what others did not, or perhaps what others preferred not to see. Each policy had been purchased mere months before the insured man's death. Each victim was in apparent good health at the time. Each one died while traveling alone, leaving no family nearby to challenge the official conclusions. And most unsettling of all, every single policy had been written by the same elusive agent, a woman whose name appeared again and again, yet who seemed to vanish from the record whenever Hartwell looked closer. 6 miles north of Charleston, at a bend in the road near Goose Creek, stood the establishment that would soon consume Hartwell's attention, the 6-mile Wayfarer House. The inn was positioned with remarkable care, isolated enough for privacy, yet close enough to the city to appear safe. Dense forest enclosed it on 3 sides, and the swampland of Goose Creek hemmed it in on the 4th, ensuring that whatever occurred there could unfold beyond the eyes of prying neighbors. Architecturally, it was everything a weary traveler could hope for. A Georgian structure with wide piazzas to catch the slightest summer breeze. Tall white columns rising proudly against the green backdrop, and floor-to-ceiling windows that gleamed in the sunlight. Inside, Persian carpets muffled footsteps. Crystal chandeliers glowed warmly, and imported furniture lent the air of a wealthy planter's drawing room rather than a roadside inn. It was as though someone had designed the house, not merely to comfort, but to dazzle. The proprietors, John and Lavinia Fisher, claimed to have purchased the property with an inheritance from a Savannah relative. The records showed they had paid in cash, and within months, they had transformed what had once been a modest coaching stop into one of the most celebrated waypoints between Charleston and Columbia. Their lavish investment hinted either at immense confidence or at access to resources most innkeepers could scarcely imagine. And then there was Lavinia herself. At 26, she was strikingly tall for a woman of her time, with auburn hair that glimmered like copper fire in the Carolina sun, and green eyes that seemed to penetrate a man's very thoughts. Her skin remained unmarked by the harsh climate, her figure perfectly suited to the corseted ideals of beauty in an era obsessed with measurements and proportions. But her true power lay not in her appearance alone. Lavinia possessed a manner that could disarm even the most hardened traveler. She had an uncanny gift for making each guest feel as though they were the singular focus of her attention, the most fascinating soul she had ever encountered. Businessmen who prided themselves on shrewdness found their caution slipping away in her presence. In a city where women were expected to remain ornamental and subdued, Lavinia wielded her charm like a weapon, an invisible blade concealed beneath silk and scripture. And as Hartwell would soon discover behind the grace and hospitality of the 6-mile Wayfarer house, a darker purpose stirred hidden beneath chandeliers and perfumed smiles. Her voice carried that unmistakable melody of low country aristocracy, soft, deliberate, and laced with the refined accent that instantly marked its speaker as a woman of breeding. In Charleston society, such a tone was a passport to respect. In Lavinia's case, it was a weapon. She moved with a grace that spoke of years of dancing lessons and finishing school polish. Yet her charm never felt rehearsed. Those who encountered her left with the same impression: a woman of rare intelligence, and rarer, still a woman who listened. She remembered the smallest details with disarming precision. Children's names, mentioned once, in casual conversation, the status of a shipment discussed months earlier, or the illness of a cousin, half forgotten even by the speaker. Her sympathy seemed boundless, her attention undivided. Men who found little comfort, even in their own homes, discovered in Lavinia a kind of warmth that felt both intoxicating and indispensable. Her husband John Fisher was the opposite in every conceivable way. Short, thick-set, and prematurely balding, he seemed almost designed to fade into the background. His neighbors called him reliable, hardworking, and modest to a fault. He devoted himself to Lavinia with an intensity that bordered on worship. While she presided over the drawing room with dazzling conversation, John kept the house running with quiet efficiency, tending the gardens, repairing woodwork, polishing brass until it gleamed. His carpentry was admired throughout the community, and he was always the first to lend a hand with the neighbors' repairs. To the outside world, he was the very picture of honesty. To the Fisher enterprise, he was the perfect shadow to his wife's brilliance. The first case that drew Samuel Hartwell's sharp attention occurred on February 14th, 1847, Valentine's Day. The irony of the date would only sink in later, once the scope of the Fishers' crimes came to light. That afternoon, cotton merchant Theodore Grayson arrived at the 6 Mile Wayfarer house, his carriage heavy with contracts and fabric samples from his Charleston meetings. At 48, Grayson was well known as a shrewd businessman, one who paired a keen understanding of cotton production with an even keener eye for exploiting the weaknesses of his rivals. By all accounts, he was at the height of his powers. The report filed by local magistrate Cornelius Weatherby, later studied line by Hartwell, described Grayson as fatigued but otherwise in perfect health upon his arrival. The weather had been unseasonably warm for February, nearing 70 degrees, and the humidity left even the hardiest travelers drained of strength. Lavinia greeted him at the door herself, a gesture that set her establishment apart from the ordinary inns where guests were received by servants or stable boys. Seeing his weariness, she insisted on preparing a restorative tea, an herbal blend she explained passed down through generations of her family. Its secret lay in blossoms grown in her own garden, cultivated with a care as delicate as her manners. Two other guests that evening, Harrison Calhoun, a rice planter, and Wesley Dree, a tobacco inspector from North Carolina, would later testify to the extraordinary attentions lavished upon Grayson. They recalled how Lavinia hovered over him with almost tender solicitude, conversing with him in a way that seemed to ease his fatigue and lift his spirits. The tea was served in her finest porcelain cups, adorned with painted roses. Its aroma carried a sweetness unfamiliar yet alluring. Grayson remarked on its unusual flavor, honey he thought, and a hint of something floral he couldn't quite place. He declared it delightful. Neither Calhoun nor Dree realized they were watching a man sip his own death sentence, his fate sealed by the elegant hand that set the cup before him. The warmth and sweetness of the tea seemed at first to restore Theodore Grayson. For nearly an hour he entertained the other guests, recounting stories of his business triumphs and his ambitious plans to expand into Georgia. His voice carried strength, his gestures were animated, and it appeared that the restorative had worked, but the change began almost imperceptibly. He grew hesitant, his words slowing, each phrase punctuated by long pauses, as though the right thought had slipped just beyond his reach. The flush in his cheeks gave way to a grey pallor that Lavinia, with her usual composure, attributed to simple weariness after a long journey. By 9 o'clock, he was clutching at his chest, complaining of sharp pains and difficulty drawing breath. Lavinia acted at once, directing John to fetch a physician from Charleston, while she herself tended to Grayson. With an air of calm authority, she guided him to his room, arranging pillows and speaking in tones so soothing that her fellow guests marveled at her composure. She promised that help was on its way, that nothing more than rest was needed, and that he would feel better in the morning. It was close to midnight when Dr. Reginald Peyton Charleston's most respected physician, even at 73 years of age, arrived. He found Grayson in grave distress, pupils wide-breathing, shallow and irregular, his body heavy with a sickly almond-like scent that seemed to cling to his very clothes. Peyton's practiced hands detected an erratic heartbeat and unmistakable signs of poisoning, though the specific substance eluded him. Despite every effort, Theodore Grayson slipped quietly away around 2 a.m. of February 15th. His body lay in the bed, as though asleep, without the violent convulsions that normally accompanied a poisoning death. It was this stillness, this eerie peace, that unsettled Dr. Peaton most. And then there were the petals. Several pink oleander blossoms scattered across the wooden floor by the bedside, their presence unexplained, their season months away. Later, when Hartwell sifted through the testimony, it was Lavinia's behavior that stood out. Witnesses recalled her composure, her efficient handling of every detail, her refusal to give in to panic. She had even cleaned and arranged the sick room before Dr. Peaton's arrival, explaining she could not bear for a dying man to lie in disorder. When Magistrate Cornelius Weatherby asked about the oleander, her answer was simple. The petals must have blown in from her garden, where ornamental bushes grew in abundance. No one present thought to question how oleander could bloom in February. The insurance claim was processed without delay. Grayson's business partner, Marcus Redmond, collected the policy, $5,000 a sum that represented nearly 10 years' wages for a common man. The policy, it turned out, had been written only 4 months earlier by a woman named Laura Ferguson, an insurance agent from Augusta whose credentials appeared flawless. But Theodore Grayson was only the beginning. As spring warmed the low country, bringing with it the clatter of commerce and the rhythm of planting, the deaths continued with unnerving regularity. Isolated though they seemed, occurring in different jurisdictions and recorded under different hands, they were bound together by their setting, their symptoms, and their hostess. In March, another victim fell, William Claiborne, a tobacco inspector from the North Carolina Commission. He had come south to investigate troubling reports about the quality of leaf bound for European markets. His work was meticulous, his reputation spotless. Yet his life ended within hours of arriving at the 6-mile Wayfarer house. Like Grayson before him, Claiborne had arrived weary, but well welcomed personally by Lavinia and offered her restorative tea. And like Grayson, his complaints of fatigue gave way to chest pains, labored breathing, and that faint floral sweetness on his breath. The attending physician, though noting details that troubled him, attributed the death to exhaustion and the unfamiliar weight of the Carolina climate. But for Hartwell, studying these cases in careful sequence, the pattern was already taking shape. Her name appeared again and again in the records. Hartwell obtained Laura Ferguson, the same woman who had written Theodore Grayson's policy only months before his death. The patterns were subtle enough to escape casual notice, but to an investigator trained to follow numbers and names rather than whispers and superstition, the connections stood out with increasing clarity. In nearly every case, the victims were prosperous men in the prime of their careers, men whose loss meant significant payouts to their business partners or families. The timing was suspicious as well. Each policy written only weeks or months before the insured's untimely demise, each claim processed smoothly with documentation in perfect order. Hartwell began assembling a private dossier. He listed dates, amounts, beneficiaries, and witnesses, noting with growing unease how frequently the trail led back to Charleston, and more specifically, to the unassuming 6-mile Wayfarer house, operated by John and Lavinia Fisher. By June, his file contained 7 deaths, all men of means, all within a 50-mile radius, all last seen alive under the roof of the Fishers' establishment. Hartwell noted with professional detachment the repeating details, the restorative tea, the sudden onset of chest pains, the almond-like odor, and the scattered oleander petals that appeared as if some morbid signature left behind by the killer. What troubled him most was not the evidence itself, but the community's refusal to see it. To neighbors, Lavinia remained the very model of Christian virtue, a woman whose charity had saved countless lives during the fever outbreak, whose generosity kept the church doors open, and whose refinement elevated every gathering she attended. To question her was to question the very image of Southern womanhood. Even Dr. Petton, despite his mounting doubts, hesitated to accuse her of wrongdoing. Coincidence, he told Hartwell during a late-night exchange of letters, is the silent partner of medicine. We see patterns where none exist, and if we accuse the wrong party, the consequences to an innocent family could be devastating. But Hartwell was no longer convinced. Coincidence could not explain the mathematics of death that followed the Fishers with mechanical precision. He began to suspect that Laura Ferguson, the mysterious insurance agent, was no independent operator, but rather part of a wider scheme, a scheme in which the Fishers played their role with chilling perfection. By midsummer of 1847, Hartwell's investigation had moved beyond quiet curiosity. He was now certain he was tracking a coordinated enterprise of murder and fraud executed under the cover of hospitality and sanctified by a community too blinded by respectability to admit what was happening in its midst. Hartwell understood the risk he was about to undertake. If his suspicions were correct, he would be entering the very lair of a criminal conspiracy that had already claimed more than a dozen lives with ruthless efficiency. The Fishers were not common innkeepers, and Laura Ferguson, if indeed she and Lavinia were one and the same, was no ordinary saleswoman. They had demonstrated an intelligence and foresight that placed them far above the crude highwaymen and petty swindlers who plagued the southern roads. Before leaving Charleston, Hartwell secured discreet support from 2 trusted colleagues within mutual insurance men who agreed to monitor his progress and act swiftly should word arrive of his disappearance. He prepared false papers identifying him as Jonathan Hale, a minor cotton broker from Savannah traveling north in search of new contracts. In his valise, he carried the ordinary equipment of a commercial traveler: ledgers, correspondence, and sample contracts, all forged with meticulous care to withstand casual scrutiny. More importantly, he carried with him a small silver flask filled with a vinegar tincture, an old investigator's precaution against poisoning, meant to dull or neutralize suspicious flavors. Whether it would prove effective against the Fishers' concoctions, he could not know, but the presence of the flask gave him a measure of reassurance as he contemplated the dangers ahead. On the evening of June 17th, 1847, Hartwell set out along the Charleston-Columbia corridor, his horse's steady pace carrying him toward the infamous 6-mile Wayfarer house. He arrived shortly before dusk, noting at once the inviting glow of lanterns in the windows and the welcoming posture of the inn, which to all outward appearances radiated safety and domestic comfort. To the weary traveler, it must have seemed a refuge. To Hartwell, it was the stage upon which a grim drama was about to unfold. John Fisher greeted him warmly at the door, a man of rugged strength, whose honest smile belied the rumors whispered along the road. Hartwell studied his eyes carefully, searching for the faintest glimmer of calculation, but saw only the open courtesy of a host accustomed to receiving strangers. Moments later, Lavinia appeared dressed in pale blue silk that caught the lantern light and made her auburn hair shimmer like copper. Her beauty was undeniable, and her charm was such that for a brief instant, Hartwell almost doubted his own conclusions. "Welcome, sir," she said, with a voice that seemed indeed like music. "You must be weary from the road. Come in and allow us to restore you with a warm supper and a cup of our special tea." It was the very phrase he had read in half a dozen witness statements, the same invitation that had preceded the deaths of so many men. Hartwell felt his pulse quicken, not with fear, but with the sharp anticipation of an investigator who knows the truth is finally within reach. Hartwell ran his fingers lightly across the polished banister, noting the craftsmanship. The inn's prosperity was not simply the product of shrewd business, but of blood. Every rug, every painting, every glittering chandelier seemed to him an artifact purchased with the lives of dead men whose fortunes had been quietly absorbed into the Fishers' household. When Lavinia returned, she carried a delicate porcelain cup on a silver tray, its contents steaming faintly with a fragrance at once sweet and bitter. The pale liquid carried a faint floral tint, so subtle one might have attributed it to hibiscus or rose, but Hartwell knew better. His pulse quickened as he accepted the cup, bowing his head slightly in thanks. "Please," she said with her disarming smile, "you must tell me what you think. So many weary travelers have found new strength in this recipe. It has a way of reviving even the most exhausted gentleman." Her words, delivered with perfect charm, felt like a sentence of death. He raised the cup, allowing the steam to brush his lips. Then, with the skill of long practice, he feigned a sip, while allowing only the smallest trace to touch his tongue. The sweetness was immediate, followed by a faint bitterness that matched precisely the physician's descriptions in the Grayson and Beaumont cases. The vinegar tincture in his pocket suddenly seemed woefully inadequate against such a calculated poison. Setting the cup down with apparent satisfaction, Hartwell smiled. "Remarkable," he said evenly. "It reminds me of a drink I once had in Savannah. Though, I must say yours has a more memorable quality." Lavinia's expression softened, but behind her green eyes, he detected a flicker of triumph. Quiet, satisfied, almost imperceptible. He had given her the confirmation she sought. Her guest had consumed the tea. Moments later, John Fisher entered the parlor, carrying Hartwell's traveling case with easy familiarity, as though inspecting its contents were a routine courtesy. The stocky innkeeper placed it by the staircase and offered his guest a nod of respect, but his watchful glance suggested calculation rather than hospitality. Hartwell knew he was being weighed, measured, and silently judged, not as a guest, but as a victim. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, yet he forced himself to remain calm. To bolt now would mean certain death. He needed evidence tangible proof strong enough to bring magistrates and lawmen down upon the Fishers. And that meant he would have to linger in this elegant death trap, pretending to be ensnared, while secretly recording every detail that might later hang his hosts at the gallows. The cup itself was finer than any ordinary inn could reasonably provide. Its porcelain surface gleamed with the thin translucence of recent import, bearing a faint hairline crack along the handle as though hurriedly wiped clean. Hartwell noticed a faint crystalline residue clinging to the inner rim, visible only when the light struck it at a certain angle. The scent rising from the steaming liquid was floral, but underlaid with the bitter, almost metallic sharpness he had come to associate with cyanide compounds. More chilling still was the way Lavinia carried the saucer. Her hands, so graceful when gesturing or pouring wine for guests, now gripped the porcelain with a steadiness that suggested ritual. She set the cup before him with reverence, like a priestess offering a chalice in some dark sacrament. "Drink while it's warm," she said gently, the corners of her mouth curving into what seemed a maternal smile. Yet beneath that tenderness, Hartwell felt the chill of calculation. Her eyes lingered on him, not with the warmth of a hostess eager to please, but with the detached attention of someone waiting for a chemical to take effect. Hartwell forced a smile, inclining his head. "Your kindness overwhelms me, madam," he said smoothly, raising the cup as though to drink. He let the rim touch his lips just long enough to mask the deception, then lowered it with a satisfied sigh. He allowed a drop to rest on his tongue, just enough to confirm the telltale bitterness, before dabbing at his mouth with a linen napkin. Lavinia's smile deepened. She believed the ritual was complete. At that moment, Hartwell's eyes flicked toward John Fisher. The innkeeper had set aside his papers and was watching with predatory stillness. His large hands rested on the back of a chair, knuckles white, as though ready to act should their guest falter. There was no warmth in his gaze now, only anticipation. For Hartwell, the performance had begun. Every gesture, every word from this moment forward would be a battle for survival. Through the thin plaster walls, Hartwell could make out the cadence of their voices. Lavinia's tones, low and controlled, carried a note of irritation rather than panic. "You saw it," she whispered sharply. "He didn't drink. He pretended." John's reply was harsher, stripped of the false geniality he had shown earlier. "Then he suspects. We can't afford another delay. Too many eyes are already turning toward Charleston after Sinclair and Peaton." Lavinia's voice softened, though the sweetness was more chilling than her anger. "Patience, my dear. A man who has traveled all day is vulnerable in other ways. Exhaustion makes the body weak. A touch of laudanum in his wine, a draught of my cordial. He won't wake before morning. You've seen it before." There was a pause, then the sound of footsteps pacing. John spoke again, lower now, but Hartwell pressed his ear against the floorboard to catch the words. "And if he doesn't wake another body so soon, and with him so well dressed, so careful. What if this one is noticed?" Lavinia laughed softly, the sound devoid of warmth. "Then we will do what we always do. The road claims many travelers. The marshes claim the rest. His name will be written in our ledger beside the others." Hartwell's stomach turned cold. The ledger. The papers John had been clutching earlier were no mere business correspondence. They were records of victims, policies, and profits. Proof of murder. As the house grew quiet again, Hartwell realized two things with terrifying clarity. First, his cover had lasted only hours before suspicion fell upon him. Second, if he hoped to live until dawn, he would need to act before the Fishers decided to act first. Hartwell lay frozen in the darkness, every whispered word from below tightening the knot of dread in his chest. What he had uncovered was far beyond anything his employers at the insurance office had imagined. This was not a string of opportunistic murders, but a carefully engineered machine of death. An enterprise with branches in multiple cities, associates in respectable positions, and a reach that extended across the South's most profitable trade routes. He understood now why the deaths had seemed so inexplicably clean, why no authorities had pressed further. The Fishers weren't simply innkeepers turned killers. They were the visible tip of a conspiracy that blended seamlessly into the social fabric of Charleston itself. Merchants, brokers, and even insurance men may have been complicit. The realization brought with it a sickening weight. If he disappeared tonight, no one would ever expose the truth. His employers might suspect, but suspicion was not proof. And proof was what he needed proof, that lay in John Fisher's ledgers, the false policies, the coded correspondence, the names of accomplices. Yet every creak of the old inn reminded him that discovery could come at any moment. He could already imagine Lavinia gliding silently up the stairs with another cup of tea, her face lit with that terrible smile. Or John slipping in through the back with a knife honed for efficiency rather than intimidation. Hartwell pressed his palm against the cool wall and forced his breathing into steady silence. He had two choices: escape now into the swamp, risking the alligators and the treacherous marsh paths under moonlight, or stay and try to obtain the ledger before dawn, gambling his life for the evidence that could dismantle an empire of murder. Either way, by morning, Samuel Hartwell knew the Fisher house would no longer be just another inn on the Charleston road. It would be remembered, if he survived, as the heart of one of the darkest criminal enterprises in American history. The revelations shocked even the most hardened Charleston investigators. What had first appeared to be a disturbing series of unexplained deaths was now exposed as one of the most calculated and methodical murder enterprises in American history. The trial of John and Lavinia Fisher began that autumn in a crowded Charleston courtroom. Society women who had once praised Lavinia's beauty and hospitality now whispered of her monstrous cruelty. Planters, merchants, and clergy filled the gallery, desperate to see how justice would handle the crimes that had so deeply violated the sacred Southern code of hospitality. Hartwell's testimony was damning. He presented his notes, the ledger entries, and the evidence retrieved from Goose Creek Swamp. Piece by piece, the prosecution dismantled the facade of piety and refinement that the Fishers had so carefully constructed. Jurors paled as Lavinia's clinical poison notes were read aloud, her detached tone describing how victims expired quietly, or how a slight adjustment in dosage produced more reliable cardiac arrest. John's defense attempted to portray him as a man manipulated by his brilliant but ruthless wife. Yet witnesses testified to his role in disposing of bodies, managing stolen goods, and intimidating potential whistleblowers. The jury was not swayed. On October 28, 1847, both John and Lavinia Fisher were found guilty of multiple counts of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. The sentence was death by hanging. The execution, carried out in front of Charleston's Old City Jail, drew a massive crowd. Contemporary reports described Lavinia's final moments as both defiant and chilling. She declared her innocence, but her words rang hollow in the shadow of overwhelming evidence. John, by contrast, wept openly, confessing that the swamp still held secrets too terrible to name. Even after their deaths, the legend of the 6-mile Wayfarer house endured. Travelers spoke of strange lights near Goose Creek, of cries in the swamp on moonless nights, and of the lingering sweetness of oleander that clung to the abandoned inn. To this day, historians debate whether Hartwell uncovered the full extent of their crimes, or whether other accomplices in Savannah and Columbia continued the enterprise long after the Fishers swung from the gallows. What remains certain is that Lavinia and John Fisher transformed the most cherished Southern virtue, hospitality, into a weapon, leaving behind one of the darkest legacies in Charleston's haunted history. Oleander became Lavinia's poison of choice. Its sweetness masked bitterness, and its effects mimicked heart failure so closely that even trained physicians saw only natural death. But during interrogation, the true scale of the Sorrells' operation began to unfold. Their inn was only one node in a sprawling criminal network that stretched across several states. The organization specialized in every service a murderer might need, identifying wealthy victims, forging documents, laundering money, and disposing of evidence. Dozens of lives had already been claimed throughout the Southeast. Lavinia herself had lived a double life as Laura Ferguson, a seemingly respectable insurance agent. With beauty charm and calculated ruthlessness, she persuaded men of means to buy policies that the network would later cash in policies written in blood. Her success was nearly flawless because she understood masculine vanity with surgical precision. The truth about their identities shocked Charleston. They were not the refined innkeepers they pretended to be, but John and Lavinia Sorrells, career criminals from New Orleans. John had once worked the riverboats as a gambler, while Lavinia had perfected the art of the con-seducing wealthy men before robbing them. Together, they built a mask of respectability, studying local aristocratic manners, fabricating backstories, even performing charitable deeds, all carefully designed to shield their crimes. Their downfall ignited one of the most sensational trials in South Carolina's history. Courtrooms overflowed with spectators, eager to glimpse the beautiful woman who had turned hospitality into murder. Lavinia, even in shackles, maintained her poise. She smiled, she charmed, she even flirted with prosecutors and jurors, as though the entire trial were another elaborate con. Some claimed she relished the attention. Her final statement before sentencing was as cold as the crimes themselves. Men are such predictable fools when it comes to a beautiful woman offering kindness. They never suspect the hand-serving tea with a smile could also measure poison with precision. We simply exploited their weakness and society's foolish belief in feminine virtue. On August 18, 1847, John Sorrells was hanged, loyal to his wife, until the end. 2 days later, Lavinia followed one of the first women executed in South Carolina. Crowds gathered for her final moment. Her last words were chilling. "I regret nothing except that we did not have more time to perfect our methods." If society insists on treating women as helpless ornaments, then it should not be surprised when some of us turn those expectations into weapons. The 6-mile Wayfarer house was abandoned immediately. Locals swore the building decayed unnaturally fast, collapsing within 2 years, as if poisoned by the evil it had contained. For decades, no one would touch the land, haunted by whispers of murdered travelers. Meanwhile, Samuel Hartwell's investigation reshaped the insurance industry itself. His meticulous documentation exposed how easily fraud could be disguised as tragedy, leading to stricter oversight, background checks, and cooperation between companies. His case notes became required reading for investigators for generations. The wider network unraveled in the years that followed, with arrests in Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana. Yet some slipped away into frontier territories where weak law enforcement allowed similar crimes to flourish in the shadows. Hartwell often reflected on how close he had come to death. Had he sipped Lavinia's tea, his passing would have been dismissed as natural, and the murders might have continued unchecked. The story of the Sorrels remains one of the most chilling lessons in how charm and hospitality can be weaponized. Lavinia's beauty and piety were her camouflage, her smile the mask of a predator. At least 23 lives were lost, perhaps more, all under the guise of Southern grace. But what do you think was the full truth uncovered? Or did accomplices escape to continue the work elsewhere? Were there other victims whose deaths were never tied to the Sorrels? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this tale of deadly deception has gripped you, subscribe to Sleepy History Tales. The shadows of the past are never empty. They still hold secrets waiting to be revealed. We'll see you in the next story.